Week 13 is officially in the books, so in today's video, let's go ahead and give my reaction to every single game of week number 13. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. Let's hop right into it. And we are going to begin with our 3 Thanksgiving games. By the way, I hope you guys had an amazing holiday break. I know I personally did. We are going to begin with the Chicago Bears and the Detroit Lions. To me, this game was a little bit too close for comfort if you were a Detroit Lions fans. Obviously, the Lions have been super dominant over the past couple weeks, but coming into this game, I did expect a little bit of a closer matchup because Chicago is a talented team. However, the one thing that I did say and that I was thinking the entire time heading into this game was that the Detroit Lions had a massive coaching advantage. And well, we kind of saw that in full display. The Chicago Bears had a chance to ultimately tie the game up with a game-tying field goal. They were in field goal range, penalty, sack, and Matt Eberflus doesn't call a timeout. Now, fortunately, Matt Eberflus was fired, which I think was very justified after what we saw in that performance, because I thought that was maybe the biggest malpractice of a coaching timeout, of a coaching effort, in maybe my entire time of watching the NFL. With 30 seconds left, you have a rookie quarterback out there and you don't call a timeout, to me is just utterly ridiculous. The mindset that I think he did have was to go out there, run a quick play, and then call a timeout to kick the game-tying field goal. But that doesn't make much sense. Even if you had called the timeout, got 32 seconds, even if that play was still inbounds, you still would have had plenty of time to get your field goal unit up and ready to go, but they didn't do so. Shout out to the Detroit Lions. This was a good win, not a pretty win, but I feel like the final score isn't as indicative of how good they actually performed. It could have definitely been better, but that is a good Chicago Bears team, so I don't feel any different about the Detroit Lions. Then we go ahead and talk about the Dallas Cowboys versus the New York Giants. I think this one is pretty easy to talk about. The New York Giants are maybe the worst team in the NFL. It's really up between them, Jacksonville, and a couple other teams, but the New York Giants are just a really bad team. Coaching-wise, I think they're coached pretty well, but they just don't have the level of talent to seriously compete against even not-so-good teams like the Dallas Cowboys. Say what you want about Dallas, but they still do have CeeDee Lamb. They still do have, in my opinion, a good enough head coach to win a couple games, and they have some really good defensive players. Now, unfortunately for Dallas, they're obviously still 5-7 and have a lot of ground to make up if they even want to have a chance to make the playoffs, which I don't think they're doing so with Cooper Rush, though Micah Parsons says they will. I don't think they will, though. This was going to be a game where, in my opinion, the stars just for Dallas were just a little bit better than the stars for the New York Giants. The New York Giants, outside of Malik Neighbors, really don't have that much. So if you just kind of take Malik Neighbors out of the game, the Giants offensively can't do a whole bunch. I thought Drew Lock was okay, but he's not obviously playing at a high enough level to lead this team to any sort of victory. So yeah, this one, in my opinion, wasn't as close as what the final score says. This game was kind of a blowout by halftime, but the Giants did make a couple plays late in the fourth quarter to kind of get themselves back into it. And then moving on, we talk about the Green Bay Packers versus the Miami Dolphins. Again, another one of those games for the Miami Dolphins where they just do not perform at a high level once they go into conditions that they're not used to. Miami, Florida, it's hot, it's nice weather, it's cool, it's amazing weather. But when you go up into Green Bay and play on Lambeau Field during the winter times, it's not so nice, it's not so pretty. And yeah, this Dolphins team just simply is not built for those conditions. This is a really tough loss for this Dolphins team because even though the final score says it was a 30-17 game, it kind of was a bit of a blowout. Green Bay was just kind of just playing really conservative in the second half to not lose the game. Jordan Love only threw the ball 28 times. They didn't want to throw any picks. I thought Jordan Love had a really solid day on all things considered. Josh Jacobs didn't have the most efficient day on the ground, but they still wanted to give him as many opportunities as they could do so. I think the Miami Dolphins have a good team, but obviously it's not a good enough team to get the job done. This is kind of the same thing we've seen from this team the past couple years. The offense will have some moments, the play calling will look good here and there, but the second they get out of their comfort zone, things just aren't going to go very well for them. And then let's go ahead and talk about the Black Friday game between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, when I made this prediction, I thought this game was not going to be all that close. In fact, I really didn't even watch this game all that much. I had it on the TV and I was just working on some other things. And then next thing I know, I look up and this is a really close and competitive matchup. I still think the Chiefs are a good team, but this is a type of performance that, in my opinion, really makes me nervous about this Chiefs team. They're 11-1, and truth be told, if a couple plays basically every single week don't go their way, this team is more like 7-4 or 8-5 or something along those lines. Again, I think this team is good, and I don't think they're a bad team by any means, but if this sort of stuff continues to happen, it's going to bite them in the ass at some point, whether it's in the regular season, the wild card, the championship game, or even in the Super Bowl. They just, for some reason, just continuously have these lucky things happen to them. And before anyone says it's rigged, guys, just be quiet. It's not rigged. It just is what it is. Whether it's a foul call that is rightfully called in some instances, maybe not every single time. Like this one in this game, there was I think a legal formation or offsides or something along those lines that should have been called, but it was, you get what I'm talking about. It was bad, but I don't know. I'm just not feeling too confident about this Chiefs team. The offensive line isn't performing very well, and the defense showed some vulnerabilities to Aiden O'Connell. By the way, Aiden O'Connell had a whale of a day. I know the numbers touchdowns-wise isn't all that great, but he was 23 for 35 for 340 yards and 2 touchdowns. Doesn't really get a whole much more better than that from a basically second-string quarterback. So no, I'm not in full-blown panic mode on this Chiefs team, but I'm definitely feeling a bit more skeptical about them. Maybe something to keep an eye on moving forward. And then we begin our Sunday noon games with the Jacksonville Jaguars versus the Houston Texans. Again, kind of like that Chiefs game, I thought this one would be a bit more of a blowout, which at one point it was a close to be blowout, but eventually the Jacksonville Jaguars did put a couple drives together to make this thing a tad bit more interesting. I always felt like Houston was going to be able to find a way to win this game, barring, a blocked punt, a fumble recovery, or an interception, which this Houston team just isn't really prone to doing. They made enough big plays to ultimately win this game versus this Jaguars team. The Jaguars, unfortunately, are going to be without Trevor Lawrence for maybe the rest of the year. That was a terrible hit from Azeez Al-Shaair. I hope that he probably will be suspended or have a big fine. Hopefully Trevor Lawrence is okay. In his absence, though, I thought Mac Jones looked surprisingly good given what we've seen from him this year. For Houston, I still am very nervous about this team. I don't think they're a top 10 team, at least in my opinion right now. They're not playing like it. CJ Stroud isn't playing the best brand of football. The offensive line still has a couple question marks. But if they can get Joe Mixon really involved in the game like they did in this one, maybe this team could win a couple playoff games and maybe surprise a couple people like myself. But let's go ahead and move on to a very close matchup. And again, a bit of a surprisingly close game between the Indianapolis Colts and the New England Patriots. Again, I kind of felt like the Indianapolis Colts should have beaten this Patriots team by a lot more, but they didn't. And that's okay, to be honest with you. Listen, at the end of the day, when you are 6-7 and looking to try to find a way to make the playoffs, a win is a win, and you take it no matter how ugly or how pretty it is. I thought Anthony played a up and down game. That's kind of been the consistent trend with him. He makes a couple really nice plays while also making a couple really bad plays. I will give him his flowers, though. He did have a couple picks, but I also thought after those picks, he played pretty well. They didn't really throw the ball a whole bunch. He only had 12 completions for 109 yards with 2 touchdowns and 2 picks. Instead, they really relied on the running game with Jonathan Taylor and Anthony Richardson and getting the ball out to their playmakers like Michael Pittman. On the opposing side, I thought for the Patriots, this was just sort of a weird game that never really felt like it was going in their favor until they found a way to get a lead, and it looked like they could hold on, but of course, eventually the Colts just made enough big plays to win it. I will say this, the going for it on the 2-point conversion late in the game is a very ballsy move from Shane Steichen. I respect it. I'm kind of shocked they did it because if the game went into overtime, I thought the Colts had the momentum to, finish this thing off in overtime, but they went for the 2-point conversion. It worked out. If it didn't work out, I think there'd be a lot of question marks surrounding that decision from Shane Steichen. Again, the Colts do have an easy schedule moving forward, so hypothetically they could go on a bit of a run here, win a couple close games with bad teams, and eventually beat a good team at some point to try and make the playoffs, but I don't think that's all that likely. They're probably going to have a mess and mistake here and there, but this Colts team is just a work in progress, especially with Anthony. Again, for the Patriots, you're 3-10. It's really not a bad loss. You looked really good for a big chunk of the game. You had a lead for a chunk of the game as well. Drake May makes good plays, a couple bad plays here and there, but mostly good. So good things are coming for this Patriots team. Just give it time. Next up, the LA Chargers versus the Atlanta Falcons. This was, in my opinion, the most frustrating game for the Atlanta Falcons that maybe I've seen all season from them. Yes, they had a couple blowout losses, but this was a game where they almost doubled the total yardage of the LA Chargers, yet still lost by 4 points. The Chargers on the day only had 131 passing yards and only 56 rushing yards, whereas the Falcons had 230 plus passing yards, 100 plus rushing yards, but what ended up killing them was the turnovers. Justin Herbert wasn't MVP Justin Herbert. They didn't have J.K. Dobbins, so this Chargers offense was always going to struggle in a matchup versus a pretty solid unit, at least for the Falcons defensively. All it really came down to was, could the defense for the Chargers make enough plays? And yeah, they did so about a couple times. Kirk Cousins having 4 interceptions, in my opinion, is pretty inexcusable. Yes, one of them was on a 4th down late in the game, just kind of throwing it up to make a play, but 3 of those were when the game was still a really close and competitive matchup, and you just can't have that. I'm not saying you bench him for Michael Penix because you just paid Kirk Cousins a shit ton of money. This is kind of the situation that you don't want to be in if you are a Falcons fan, with Kirk Cousins struggling and you have this nice, shiny little toy in Michael Penix. But if he keeps playing like this, he will get benched. I will say that. 4 interceptions versus a Chargers defense that is good but has some susceptible moments is inexcusable, especially when you are running the ball effectively with Bijan and occasionally Tyler Algier. He didn't have the greatest day though. I am in full-blown panic mode for this Falcons team. They are losing their grip of the lead in the division, and yes, they have the tiebreakers over the Buccaneers, but they keep playing like this, they will lose a lot more games, and I think Tampa Bay is starting to play a lot better football than this Falcons team, so I am very worried for this Falcons team, especially with how talented they are. It would be a really bad look to lose the division, especially when you had a pretty sizable lead within the division. For the LA Chargers side of things, again, it wasn't a good day, all things considered, for the offense, but your defense made a lot of really nice plays. This is an awesome Chargers defense. It's not a top 3 unit in the NFL, but statistically speaking, they're up there with the top defenses out there. I think this Chargers defense is going to continue to play well, and if they play like this in the playoffs, they're going to win a couple games, but, we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, I want to see Herbert play better football than what he did out there today, but that is a good Falcons secondary, so it's kind of understandable. And then moving on to the New York Jets versus the Seattle Seahawks, and I think this is a good old classic gritty win for a Seahawks team that is starting to peak at a really good time. As we sit here today, the Seattle Seahawks are currently in the lead for the division. The Cardinals just had a loss, which by the way we'll talk about here in a second, and the Niners also just lost, which we'll also talk about here soon. So really the only competition for the Seahawks team, at least in the immediate aftermath of this week, is the LA Rams. Now that LA Rams team is really good and can definitely put some things together to make a run for the Seahawks team, but the Seahawks are starting to play good football when it matters most. On the day versus this Jets defense that is really good, they had a nice day. Geno Smith was 20 for 31 for 206 yards and a touchdown. They couldn't really run the ball all that effectively, unfortunately, but there was a couple nice runs sprinkled in there here and there. Jackson Smith and Jigba led all the receivers with 74 passing yards. Definitely not the greatest day offensively, but they got the job done, and that's really all that matters. This was a really weird game where the Jets just felt like they had everything going for them in that first half, and then the Seahawks kind of weathered the storm, made a couple of plays in special teams, got some turnovers, made some plays offensively, and eventually they found a way to win the game. The Jets, on the other hand, had a second half blunder, 0 points in the second half compared to 21 in the first half. Aaron Rodgers is now starting to point the finger at everyone else. I think this is in my opinion, a bit of a colossal failure of the entirety of the organization, firing your head coach like 5 weeks into the season, putting everything in on 40-plus-year-old Aaron Rodgers, bringing in Devontae Adams. And I think this is sort of the repercussions of their actions. This is something that is going to be talked about throughout history for the next couple years, because this Jets team was kind of supposed to be the next big thing, but they're not. Next up, we have a beatdown, a big-time blowout for the Washington Commanders over the Tennessee Titans. Now, I have to admit, I thought Tennessee was going to win this one, and yeah, it was a terrible, terrible, terrible pick. I will say, the Washington Commanders had a gigantic monster, just tidal wave of just momentum in that first half. So many positive plays went their way, and so many bad plays went the Titans' way. Whether it was a fumble, a special teams play, Jaden Daniels playing lights out, Will Levis making a couple shaky plays to start the game off, it was like a tidal wave of momentum from the get-go, and it really put the Titans in a big-time deficit. After the first quarter, they were down 21-0, and if it wasn't for a couple late scores late in the game, the final score wouldn't have been, I guess, as close as it is now. I mean, it was a 19-42 game, but this game felt like it was 70-0 after the first quarter, because that's how dominant the Commanders were to start this game off. This game was basically in no doubt after like 5 minutes into the game. Once you saw the momentum that the Washington Commanders had, the Titans just had no shot at all. I will give some credit to Will Levis. He had a couple really nice drives. Didn't put the team in jeopardy all that much, but the special teams and defense really let the Titans down in this one. They're now 3-9, and they're probably looking for a top 5 pick. So a loss like this, while embarrassing and while tragic, isn't the worst thing in the world. For the Commanders, hopefully this is a good sort of bounce back performance from these past couple struggling weeks. Hopefully this is a type of game that can give them some momentum to go down this final stretch and make a nice solid run to maybe win the division or at least make a wild card spot. Next up, we had a shootout between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Cincinnati Bengals, and when was the last time that we said the Pittsburgh Steelers won a shootout? This was a really bizarre AFC North game that I haven't seen from this Steelers team in quite some time, and I gotta say, I am extremely impressed. Typically, the Steelers win because of defense, running the football, and just making enough plays through the passing game to ultimately find a way to win this one. But in this game, Russell Wilson, over 400 passing yards and over 40 points scored. George Pickens, while only having 3 receptions, had over 70 receiving yards and a nice touchdown. Najee Harris with 75 yards on 16 carries. Joe Burrow on the opposite side for the Bengals had himself a nice day, but also made a couple mistakes, which is kind of why the Pittsburgh Steelers won this game. This game really came down to which defense was going to make enough big plays to find a way to win. Again, it was a good old classic shootout where both offenses were clicking at a very high level, and it just came down to which defense could force a turnover or make a big time sack or make a big time play. And unfortunately, this Bengals defense just couldn't do so after that initial first quarter. Whereas the Steelers, with TJ Watt and some of their guys, made enough big plays to keep themselves in it, while also giving them a chance to eventually pull away late into the game. Russell Wilson had a fantastic game. Second quarter, they scored over 20 points. The second half was really clean. They did have the interception on the day, but I thought it was a really good standout performance from a quarterback in Russell Wilson, who hasn't had this type of performance basically since Seattle. For Cincinnati, obviously your season's over. It's kind of been over the past 3 or 4 weeks, but this kind of put the nail in the coffin. Again, I thought Joe Burrow made a lot of big time plays. You put up 38 points and you still found a way to lose. That's just unfortunate. The defense has been really bad this year. I think they might need a coaching change as well. We'll see what the Bengals can get down to in the offseason, but I think at this point, you're just playing for pride and money at this point. And then our last noon game between the Minnesota Vikings and the Arizona Cardinals. Now, I know the Vikings are going up against a Cardinals team that sort of has this stereotype of not being a good team, but this is a really good quality win against a really good and quality team in the Arizona Cardinals for the Minnesota Vikings. I know people have kind of been harping on Minnesota for having a bit of a cupcake schedule since their most recent couple, struggling games after, beating the Rams barely and having a couple bad performances where they found a way to win. This game, though, is against a good opponent, and they won soundly. Arizona made a couple really nice plays, but some of those turnovers from Kyler Murray were just really, really bad. After Kyler put himself in the MVP conversation against the Jets, he hasn't quite looked the same the past couple weeks, making some really boneheaded decisions. And that's kind of what happened in this one. I thought outside of those boneheaded decisions, he had a pretty solid day, all things considered, but those interceptions were pretty tough. And on the opposite side, Sam Darnold played really clean football. The second half was much better than the first half for this Vikings team. I thought they played really good, complimentary football, even though the rushing game wasn't great, had some fumbles, had some issues. Aaron Jones did get a couple touchdowns to make everything look a little bit better. Justin Jefferson continues to prove his worth. Trey McBride, 12 receptions for 96 yards, had an awesome day. Unfortunately for the Cardinals, their grip of the lead in their division is slipping away, but they do have a couple of opportunities later in the season to potentially find their way back into winning the division or even making the wild card. Whereas for the Minnesota Vikings, again, a quality win versus a quality opponent. This could be like a low-key wild card matchup we see at some point. So this was a good playoff-like game for this Minnesota Vikings team. And even though the final score doesn't show a dominant performance, I thought they played pretty damn well. But then we begin our 3 o'clock game, starting off with the LA Rams versus the New Orleans Saints. The Saints are just a really good, gritty team that isn't going to win a bunch of games. And that's kind of tough to say. With Alvin Kamara, Derek Carr, a couple of really solid offensive linemen, some solid defensive pieces, they're always going to have these competitive matchups, especially because Derek Carr is a solid quarterback. But they're going to have a really hard time winning some of these games later into the season. And when you go up against the Rams team that has an experienced quarterback, Puka Nacua, Kyron Williams, a bunch of really good coaches and players, it's going to be a tough matchup. Now, the Rams really came into this game very slow. They scored 0 points in the first half before finally getting some things going in that second half. I thought the Saints defensively were really good in the first half. Then some things in the second half kind of did not go their way. But the Saints were just never going to win this game off the backs of their defense. They needed Derek Carr and Alvin Kamara to make bigger chunk plays, make some splashy plays, and they just couldn't do so in the second half, unfortunately. The Saints did ultimately lose, but again, it's not a bad thing. You're kind of tanking for a high draft pick. Whereas for the LA Rams, you're trying to get back into the playoff discussion, and this type of performance versus a good, okay team versus the Saints is definitely nice to see, especially in that second half. Next up, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the Carolina Panthers. We're going to really focus in on the Carolina Panthers side of things, but real quickly, I do want to give a shout out to this Buccaneers team. Since getting Mike Evans back and getting a tad bit more healthy, this team has been playing better football. Baker Mayfield did not have a good day, so I'm not too worried about the overall closeness and competitiveness of this game because typically Baker Mayfield is much better than what he showed up there. However, Mike Evans made a couple really nice plays, and Bucky Irving with over 150 rushing yards in the day is really promising for the future of this season for this Buccaneers team. Again, the Falcons are really struggling and the Buccaneers are playing really good football, so if they can go on a bit of a winning streak, they could end up winning the division. Whereas for Carolina, I know they've lost their past 2 games, but they lost to the Chiefs, who are already a lock to make the playoffs, and the Buccaneers, who I think are also really close to making the playoffs as well, and they've lost those 2 games by like a combined, 6 or 5 points? Bryce Young, admittedly, has played really good football lately. Again, not like MVP quality type of play, but just really good quality football. And I think Dave Canales is really starting to trust him a lot more. He threw the ball 46 times today. And Bryce Young didn't throw any interceptions, was really clean with the football. I thought his pocket presence was really sharp in this one, and he looked pretty accurate when he needed to. Unfortunately for him, again, kind of a theme for a couple of these teams, they just don't have the talent to seriously match up with a really good Buccaneers team or a really good Chiefs team. Bryce Young, if he keeps playing like this, is going to be the starting quarterback in 2025, I think, regardless of how he performs these next couple weeks, because this is a really good, shining moment for a quarterback that feels like he's starting to figure things out. They can just really settle in this offensive line, add some playmakers on the outside, and dress up this defense really nicely. This Panthers team could be something pretty good within the next couple years if Bryce keeps playing like this. And then moving on to the Baltimore Ravens versus the Philadelphia Eagles, I came into this game expecting some big time MVP quality players like Jalen Hurts, Saquon Barkley, AJ Brown, Derrick Henry, and Lamar Jackson to play like MVP caliber guys, and I feel like we kind of got that. Both running games were really dominant on the day. The Ravens had over 150 rushing yards. The Eagles had just a couple yards less than 150 rushing yards. Both teams are known for their rushing games, so I kind of did expect that. Unfortunately, in this game, the Ravens offense just couldn't really get going to the extent that you would want them to do. They were really good to open the game up, but it felt like after that opening first quarter where they couldn't get the ball into the end zone, just kind of felt like they came out really flat in that second and third quarter, and it just kind of ended up biting them in the ass. Whereas for the Eagles, it was a very slow start. They did not get anything going in that first quarter, but then the second quarter happened, and that kind of sealed this game up for them. Their dominance in the second quarter and finding a way to have a lead at halftime despite not playing all that well in the first quarter and the first half, all things considered, was really impressive. And they found a way to ultimately pull away in that fourth quarter with that big Saquon run. Lamar Jackson, I thought, had a fine day passing the ball, but also wasn't particularly MVP-like, if you get my drift. Whereas Saquon, I thought he had a nice day. I thought Hurts had a nice day, even though he didn't pass the ball all that much. He was running very effectively and didn't turn the ball over, which was very important for this Eagles team. Both these teams are really good, but I do think clearly one team is just a little bit better, and that's the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles have a recipe, and I think they understand who they are and what their flaws are. They're not a team that's going to drop back Jalen Hurts 60 times and expect him to make these high IQ throws. You have Saquon, and you have the legs of Jalen Hurts, so use them, especially behind your big boys in the offensive line. And hell, when you do want to throw the football, you have AJ Brown and Devontae Smith on the outside, who are big-time playmakers just waiting to get the ball. Whereas for this Ravens team, their defense, I thought, played pretty damn well in this game. Shout out to the Eagles defense. They also played well. But for the Ravens side of things, that Ravens defense has been very suspect all year long, but they held an Eagles team to only 24 points. So really just came down to, could the offense score touchdowns? And they just couldn't. So shout out to the Eagles defense for making some big-time plays. And lastly, we're going to talk about the Buffalo Bills versus the San Francisco 49ers. Now, I'm actually recording this game with 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter, but the game is essentially wrapped up. The score is right now 35-10, so if that's not the final score by the time the game is officially over with, that's why I'm watching it, or I'm recording this with 5 minutes left. Josh Allen was just dominant. The ground game was unbelievable. Really weird conditions with the snow and all that, so I always kind of felt like Buffalo had a huge advantage, and yeah, they had a massive advantage. For the 49ers, they've been figured out. Brock Purdy did not play well in this one. He's coming off an injury. Christian McCaffrey went out early in this game. I doubt he's going to play the rest of the season just because of how bad the year has been for San Francisco. They might just want to keep him ready for next year. Jordan Mason got a couple runs going. Deebo Samuel made a couple of nice plays, but they just couldn't do much offensively when they got good field position, or once they had a nice big run, they couldn't pass the ball, and the Buffalo Bills defense is really damn good. Josh Allen wasn't having a 300 passing yard type of game. He quite honestly couldn't, with the weather being how it was. So all the defense had to do was just really shut down the ground game for Josh and James Cook and all these other guys, but they couldn't do so. This Bills team, when they're playing at a high level and just truly executing the game plan and playing the fundamentals at a high level, this Bills team is damn near impossible to beat. So when a game like this happens where they are connecting on that sort of way, they're not going to find ways to win or they're not going to find too many ways to lose because of how talented they are. And in this game, they dominated the San Francisco 49ers. So yeah, shout out to the Buffalo Bills. Now, there is one game that I unfortunately will not be able to talk about, and that is the Browns versus the Broncos. If you guys do want to see my opinion of that game, I will have a community post on my community tab where you can check out my thoughts of the game. And real quick, I also did want to show off my picks to show you guys what my predictions were and how accurate I was. I did really solid this week. Also, check out that prediction record. That's pretty damn good in my opinion. But if you guys did enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys.